The sound of shattering glass pierced the quiet neighborhood as James hurled another empty bottle against his living room wall. Outside, Ellen Harper froze on her porch, the words she would speak the next morning already forming in her mind, words that would change everything for the broken soldier next door. Before we continue this powerful journey of healing and human connection, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of our shared humanity. James Mitchell had been home for exactly 73 days, but he hadn't truly come home at all. The physical shell of the man who had left for Afghanistan 2 years earlier had returned, but the soul inside was unrecognizable, even to himself. The modest suburban house he'd purchased before deployment stood in stark contrast to the war-torn landscapes that still dominated his dreams. White picket fence, neatly trimmed lawn, American flag hanging proudly by the door, all the trappings of the normal life he'd once imagined for himself. Now these symbols of domestic tranquility felt like props on a stage where he was merely an actor who had forgotten his lines. James moved through his days mechanically. Wake up screaming at 3 a.m. Stare at the ceiling until dawn. Force down half a piece of toast. Sit on the couch. Drink until the memories blurred. Repeat. The only variation in this routine was the occasional trip to the VA hospital, where well-meaning doctors prescribed medications that gathered dust on his bathroom counter. His neighbors had initially welcomed him home with casseroles and grateful handshakes, but their enthusiasm had waned as James remained distant, his curtains perpetually drawn. All except for Ellen Harper, the silver-haired widow next door who continued to wave cheerfully whenever she caught a glimpse of him collecting his mail or taking out the trash. Ellen had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. She had seen families come and go, children grow up, marriages dissolve, and new life begin. At 72, she possessed the quiet wisdom that comes from decades of observing human nature. Her husband, Robert, had been a Vietnam veteran who had fought his own battles with what they now called PTSD. She recognized the signs in James immediately. On this particular evening, as the sound of breaking glass echoed through the walls, Ellen stood on her porch with a heavy heart. She had been patient, giving James the space she knew he needed. But tonight, something told her that time was running out. The following morning dawned crisp and clear. James had finally fallen into a fitful sleep around 5 a.m., sprawled across his couch surrounded by the evidence of another night lost to alcohol and rage. The gentle but persistent knocking at his front door dragged him back to consciousness. He considered ignoring it, as he did most human contact these days, but something about the rhythm of the knocks, determined yet patient, compelled him to answer. Running a hand through his unkempt hair and pulling his wrinkled t-shirt straight, he opened the door to find Ellen Harper standing there with a toolbox in one hand and a thermos in the other. "Good morning, James," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "I heard you redecorating last night. Thought you might need some help cleaning up." Before he could respond, she had stepped past him into the house, seemingly unfazed by the disaster zone that greeted her. Glass fragments sparkled across the hardwood floor, empty takeout containers created small mountains on every surface, and the stale smell of unwashed laundry and alcohol hung in the air. "Mrs. Harper, I don't need," James began, embarrassment and irritation fighting for dominance in his tone. "Ellen," she corrected, setting down her toolbox. "And I know you don't need my help. But I'm giving it anyway." She poured steaming coffee from the thermos into the cap and handed it to him. "Drink this. You look terrible." The bluntness of her assessment startled a small laugh from him, the first genuine sound of amusement he'd made since returning home. He accepted the coffee and took a cautious sip. It was strong and sweet, exactly how he liked it. "How did you know?" he asked, gesturing to the coffee. "Your father told me," she replied, already pulling on a pair of work gloves from her toolbox. "When you were deployed, he'd come by sometimes. We'd have coffee and he'd talk about you. Proud as could be." James felt a pang at the mention of his father, who had passed away 6 months into his deployment. He hadn't been able to come home for the funeral, his unit had been in the middle of a critical operation. Another failure to add to his growing list. "I didn't know you knew my dad," he said quietly. "There's a lot you don't know, James," Ellen replied, handing him a broom. "Now, are you going to help me clean up this mess, or are you going to stand there looking pitiful all day?" Something about her no-nonsense approach broke through his defenses. Without another word, he took the broom and began sweeping up the glass while Ellen tackled the kitchen. They worked in companionable silence for nearly an hour before James finally spoke again. "Why are you doing this?" Ellen paused, a garbage bag in her hands. "Because someone did it for Robert, my husband, when he came back from Vietnam. And because no one should have to climb out of the darkness alone." "I'm not in darkness," James protested weakly. Ellen fixed him with a knowing look. "Aren't you?" The simple question hung in the air between them, unanswered but undeniable. Over the next few weeks, Ellen became a regular presence in James's life. She didn't force conversation or demand explanations for his moods. Instead, she simply showed up, sometimes with food, sometimes with tools for small repairs around the house, sometimes with nothing but her steady presence. James found himself gradually adjusting to her company. The nightmares didn't stop, but knowing that morning would bring Ellen's knock on his door gave him something to hold on to in the darkest hours. One afternoon, as they sat on his newly cleaned porch drinking lemonade, James finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. "What happened to your husband? After Vietnam?" Ellen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "He struggled. For years. Nightmares, flashbacks, anger that seemed to come from nowhere. Back then, they didn't have a name for it, or at least not one anyone wanted to say out loud. They just expected men to come home and pick up where they left off." "That's still what they expect," James said bitterly. "Yes," Ellen agreed. "The world hasn't gotten much wiser about some things. But Robert found his way back, eventually. He became a carpenter. Said working with his hands kept the memories at bay. He built half the furniture in my house." "How did he? I mean, what helped him?" James asked, trying to keep the desperate hope out of his voice. Ellen turned to look at him directly. "Time. Work that mattered. And people who didn't give up on him, even when he tried to push them away." She reached over and patted his hand. "Sound familiar?" James managed a small smile. "Maybe a little." "He also joined a veterans group at the community center," Ellen continued. "Said it helped to talk to people who understood. They still meet there, you know. Tuesdays at 7. James tensed immediately. "I'm not ready for that." "I didn't say you were," Ellen replied calmly. "Just information for when you might be." The conversation shifted to safer topics, the neighbor's new puppy, the upcoming town festival, Ellen's ongoing battle with the squirrels in her garden. But the seed had been planted in James's mind. The following Tuesday, James found himself sitting in his car outside the community center, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He had been there for 20 minutes, watching other men arrive and enter the building, unable to make himself join them. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Ellen, "No pressure. But if you decide to go in, I'll have apple pie waiting when you get back." James stared at the message, a lump forming in his throat. How had she known he was here? Then he spotted her ancient blue Buick parked discreetly at the far end of the lot. She was giving him space but letting him know he wasn't alone. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car and walked toward the building. Each step felt like moving through quicksand, but he kept going, Ellen's promise of pie and her unwavering support propelling him forward. The meeting room was simple, folding chairs arranged in a circle, coffee brewing in the corner, a few plates of cookies on a side table. About 15 men of various ages sat talking quietly among themselves. They looked up as James entered, and he nearly turned and fled. But then an older man with a Vietnam veteran's cap stood up and walked over, hand extended. "First time's the hardest," he said simply. "I'm Mike." "James," he replied, shaking the offered hand. "Coffee?" Mike asked, already moving toward the pot. "Sure," James said, following him. The simple interaction, the normalcy of it, eased some of the tension in his shoulders. As the meeting began, James sat silently, listening as others shared their experiences. Some stories were hauntingly familiar: the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the feeling of disconnection from civilian life. Others offered perspectives he hadn't considered, strategies he hadn't tried. When it came his turn to speak, James surprised himself by finding words. "I'm James. Afghanistan, 2 tours. Been back 73 days. He paused, swallowing hard. "I don't know how to be here anymore." The simple admission felt like ripping off a bandage, painful but somehow relieving. The men around him nodded in understanding. No platitudes, no easy answers, just recognition of a shared struggle. "Welcome home, James," Mike said quietly. "For real this time." When James returned to his house that night, Ellen was waiting on her porch with 2 slices of apple pie. They sat side by side in comfortable silence as James ate his piece in 3 large bites. "Good?" Ellen asked, amusement in her voice. "Best I've ever had," James admitted. "Thank you. Not just for the pie." Ellen nodded, understanding the deeper gratitude. "You're welcome." "How was it?" James considered the question. "Hard," he finally said. "But good, I think. I'm going back next week." "I'm glad," Ellen said simply. They sat together as twilight deepened into night, the first stars appearing overhead. James felt something shift inside him, not healing exactly, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward it. "Ellen," he said suddenly, "what did someone say to Robert? You mentioned that someone helped him when he came back." Ellen smiled, her face softening with memory. "Our neighbor at the time, old Mr. Callahan. Robert was having a bad day, breaking things, shouting. Mr. Callahan came over, took one look at the situation, and instead of backing away, he walked right up to Robert and said something that changed everything." "What was it?" James asked. Ellen turned to him, her eyes bright in the gathering darkness. He said, "The war is over, son. It's time to come home." The words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. James felt them sink into his consciousness, challenging the narrative he'd been telling himself since his return. "Is it really that simple?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Ellen replied honestly. "It's the hardest thing in the world. But it starts with believing it's possible." The weeks that followed marked a gradual transformation in James's life. He continued attending the veterans group, sometimes speaking, sometimes just listening. He started helping Ellen with projects around her house, fixing her leaky faucet, repainting her porch, building a new trellis for her climbing roses. Working with his hands, as Robert had done, gave James a focus outside his own thoughts. The physical exertion tired him enough that sleep came a little easier, and the nightmares, while still present, began to lose some of their power. One afternoon, as James was replacing some rotted boards on Ellen's deck, Mike from the veterans group stopped by. "Ellen mentioned you're good with tools," he said after greetings were exchanged. "We've got a project going, renovating homes for veterans' families who can't afford repairs. Could use another pair of hands if you're interested." James hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that." The volunteer work became another anchor in James's week. There was something profoundly healing about using his strength to build rather than destroy, to create safe spaces for others when he was still learning to create one for himself. It wasn't a smooth journey. There were still bad days, days when the memories ambushed him, when the guilt over surviving when others hadn't threatened to overwhelm him. On those days, he sometimes retreated back into isolation, ignoring Ellen's knocks and the concerned texts from his new friends. But the difference now was that he couldn't disappear completely. Ellen would leave containers of soup on his porch with notes that made him smile despite himself. Mike would call with questions about an upcoming renovation project, pulling James back into the world of the living with practical matters that needed his attention. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, James began to reclaim pieces of himself. He started running in the mornings, the physical discipline reminiscent of his military training but repurposed for healing rather than preparation for combat. He enrolled in a carpentry class at the community college, formalizing the skills he'd been developing through volunteer work. And he began to talk, really talk, about his experiences. First with his therapist at the VA, whom he finally started seeing regularly, then with the men in his group, and eventually with Ellen, who listened without judgment as he haltingly described the horrors he had witnessed and participated in. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself," he admitted to her one evening, 6 months after she had first knocked on his door. "Forgiveness isn't something you achieve once and for all," Ellen replied. "It's a choice you make every day. Robert taught me that." A year after James's return, the neighborhood held its annual summer block party. In previous months, such an event would have been unthinkable for James: too many people, too much noise, too many opportunities for something to trigger his hypervigilance. But now, standing at Ellen's side as she introduced him to neighbors he had been avoiding for months, James found himself able to engage in small talk, to smile at children running past with water balloons, to accept a plate of barbecue from the community grill. "James has been helping with Homes for Heroes," Ellen was telling Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street. "They just finished their 10th renovation last week." "That's wonderful," Mrs. Rodriguez said warmly. "My nephew is in the Marines. It's good to know there are people like you looking out for our servicemen when they come home." James felt a flush of pride mixed with humility. "It's the least I can do," he said. "They helped me as much as I helped them." As the evening progressed, James found himself at the center of a small group of neighbors, describing the latest renovation project. He realized with a start that he was enjoying himself, the simple pleasure of human connection that had once seemed lost to him forever. Later, as the party wound down and neighbors drifted back to their homes, James helped Ellen carry her folding chairs and leftover potato salad back to her house. "Thank you for dragging me to that," he said as they stored the food in her refrigerator. "I didn't drag you anywhere," Ellen corrected with a smile. "You walked over all on your own." James paused, realizing she was right. "I guess I did." Ellen studied him for a moment, her head tilted to one side. "You know, you remind me more of Robert every day. Is that a good thing?" James asked. "The best," Ellen assured him. "He would have liked you very much." As James walked back to his own house that night, a house that now felt like a home rather than a prison, he reflected on the journey of the past year. He wasn't fixed or cured. The war would always be part of him, the losses he'd suffered permanently etched into his soul. But he was learning to carry those experiences differently, to integrate them into a life that contained more than just pain and regret. He thought of Ellen's words that first night on the porch: "The war is over, son. It's time to come home." At the time, they had seemed impossible, almost cruel in their simplicity. Now he understood that they weren't a statement of fact but an invitation to possibility, a door held open that he had to choose to walk through every single day. 5 years later, James stood in the community center, pinning a medal to Mike's shirt at a ceremony honoring the Homes for Heroes volunteers. The program had grown exponentially, now serving veterans across 3 counties, with James as its director. His life had expanded in ways he couldn't have imagined during those dark early days after his return. He had completed a degree in social work, specializing in veteran services. He had reconnected with old friends and made new ones. He had even started dating Sarah, a kind-eyed art therapist who worked with veterans' children and understood the ongoing nature of his healing journey. But